Welcome back to Media7, where we're discussing the role women's studies has played in our media culture for the past 40 years. In the meantime, though, Sarah Daniel meets a former women's studies student. We think you'll recognise him.
Kia ora, good evening. Tonight we're discussing the demise of the Women's Studies course at Victoria University, and with us in the studio is special guest and graduate of that course, journalist John Campbell. Welcome, John, and thank you for coming to the show.
Yeah, it's lovely to be on my own set. It's very exciting.
When did you sign up for the course?
I don't really remember, but it must have been about 83 or 84, I think. And it occurred to me, and I was only doing literature, that's all I did. I only did literature papers. So I did classics if it was literature, I did Russian if it was literature, but mostly I was doing English lit. And it occurred to me that in 3 years, 2 full years, it must have been my 3rd year, I hadn't read, I think I'd read 1 female author. Staggeringly, I must have done dozens and dozens of authors. And then there was this paper called Women in Literature, which was in the Women's Studies department, and obviously it was only female authors, and I thought, well, I should do that.
You were the only male on the course for 2 years. Did you score?
No, I failed spectacularly to score. I was very earnest. I mean, I think probably secretly, deep inside myself, you know, that had action been available to the only chap on the course, then I would have, you know, been readily, you know, forthcoming. But I don't, in good faith, I don't think that's why I was there. The first tutorial was one of the most uncomfortable hours I'd ever had in my 18 or 19 years on the planet, which was a very sheltered and cosseted life. But we went round, unfortunately, we went round clockwise, describing our experiences of being a woman, starting on my left. And without exception, these women had all been the victims of some appalling behaviour, you know, and then that got to me. You know,
what did you do? Did you have to make up a lie?
I sort of apologised, really, on behalf of... Oh. I can't really remember what it, but I remember, you know, that my voice was, you know, it's probably, oh, goodness. You know, you think, shit, you know, this is unbelievable. People were crying and comforting each other. You know, I was sitting there like, you know, the sort of KKK member of a, you know, at a Martin Luther King rally, just feeling like a total, like a turkey. But, you know, it was great. You know, it made me... I think life is about being as two-eyed as possible. I just think that's our responsibility. I just think that's what we're here for, to see the world in two-eyed terms. And that was part of the process of being as two-eyed as I possibly could be. So I feel there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that it was important and valid and critical when I was 18, 19, 20 or whatever, that universities needed it and the country needed it and we all needed it. I hope that's less the case now. We've had 2 female prime ministers. You know, the CEO of this company is a woman. My last 2 bosses have been women. You know, CEO of Telecom, the previous one was... You know, I think, you know, those glass ceilings that hadn't been broken when I was a student have all been broken now, and I hope that means that women's studies is... But maybe we still need it just for different reasons.
Given the recent antics of our Prime Minister appearing on Tony Veitch's radio show to discuss whether women are hot or not, do you think that suggests we need this course more now than ever?
I get a bit confused about this stuff. At some level, whilst, you know, Sue Kedgley and the bourgeoisie of Grey Lynn are kind of appalled by John Key saying, you know, Liz Hurley is hot, actually, the vast majority of men on New Zealand are thinking, well, she is hot. You know, she is. And so the question is, how do we have these conversations? What's the language in which it's okay to say, isn't Liz Hurley a gorgeous woman? She may be as thick as a plank, and she's clearly dating a moron, but every time I look at her, I think, whoa. You know, how do we have those conversations? In what terms is it okay to say that stuff when people feel it? I don't know about having it with Tony Veitch necessarily. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Marvellous stuff. Deborah, John went through a couple of things there. I mean, is he right with in regards to the Prime Ministerial hottie meter? Are we just taking that too seriously? Is
yes,
that something?
I was not appalled by that. No, he was asked if Liz Hurley was hot, and he said yes. I mean, if he'd said she was not hot, he would have. It was damned if he didn't, damned if he didn't. And John Campbell's right. Middle New Zealand thinks she's gorgeous. It's just another way of saying she was gorgeous, and we just got we were too prissy over that.
And I think that's the great thing with John Key with that comment actually, is that he's relating directly to Middle New Zealand when he admits that, you know, Liz Hurley is pretty good looking. So, yeah, I think we are taking it a bit too seriously.
Because there is an interesting thing here where you can't discuss someone's physicality without objectifying them, essentially, but we kind of do that all the time, really.
You know, I wrote a column where I damned these guys in New Zealand, said to Anna Faris those things which I can't repeat on television, these obscenities that they yelled from cars. And I thought that was just ghastly that they said it. And I thought it was even worse that Tourism New Zealand said that she asked for it because of the roles that she plays in movies. But then I thought about my own column, and my own column actually changed what I thought. And I thought, well, maybe we've got so closed-minded about what we do to young men in New Zealand that the only way that they feel that they can express their feelings about women, maybe, I don't know if I'm even right here, the only way some young men can say what they feel about young women is driving around in cars and hurling obscenities at them from cars. I don't know.
So send them to women's studies, I guess.
Send them
Pack
to
them off
women's
to the
studies.
boot
Yes,
camp.
maybe we should have women's studies for these young men so they know how to behave.
Chris, there's an interesting track here. The idea that the feminist intellectuals just don't seem to be as visible as they used to be on our TV screens, on the mainstream media.
Well, I must say, I find it strange that in this lineup tonight there isn't a Sandra Coney or a Sue Kedgley or a Marilyn Waring, because it strikes me as you know, a moment in our history that was actually worthy of a bit of protest from those who were there at the time women's studies were set up. I don't think it's at all reasonable to propose that there is no need for women's studies anymore. Women still earn less than men. Women are still subjected to violence from men on a massive scale. And I'm hoping that the lack of noise around the closure of the women's studies course is not because middle class women have broken through all the glass ceilings, and middle class women are now able to aspire to be Prime Minister or head of telecom, because the people who still need that challenging academic discourse aren't in fact middle class women, they're working class women, and they are the ones who are still on the receiving end of much of the violence, much of the exploitation. And you know, I've always been something of a critic of women's studies courses precisely because it always seemed to me that they were elevating the identity question far above what was warranted, and neglecting that you know, horrible word class.
We did actually try to get all these people on, but some of them couldn't make it. But quite a large part of them just balked, I guess, at the idea. Hannah, how important is gender as an issue to you personally and to, I guess, your generation?
I think it's hugely important. I mean, I passionately believe that it's probably the #1 issue that will face my generation. I think that kind of the crisis of the modern young woman and the crisis of the modern young man, I don't think the answer is sending, you know, young men at 18 or 19 to women's studies degrees. I think it's actually really, I actually am really excited that these courses have been shut down, because I think it actually gives us a really unique opportunity to discuss an issue which hasn't been discussed in New Zealand before, and it's this whole issue of gender. And we have the middle class woman coming up in society and really kind of breaking through with all this new sense of pride and being a young woman, that the media is telling me that I can go out and achieve anything that I want to be. But then at the same time, you know, a lot of governmental policy still supports women staying at home. I mean, the Working Families Bill, for example, you know, still makes it easier for mum to stay at home and look after the kids, and dad to go off to work and be the central breadwinner. So there is kind of a real dichotomy a little bit.
Not in the last 30 years.
In the
not in the last 30
representation
years.
of media.
I think that's a complete misrepresentation of reality.
I mean, having just done the course, personally, how I feel...
I'm not interested in what you did on the course. Most women in New Zealand have to go out to work. You're a very lucky woman indeed if your partner earns enough money for you to be able to stay at home and not actually add your income to his to make ends meet.
But I think a lot of women are feeling like they have to make that sacrifice. I mean, I look at a lot of girls that were on my course with me, and half of them think that they can go out there and be CEOs of companies and be a size 6 and at the same time still look after their children and bring them up and be a stay-at-home mum. And there's this huge kind of crisis that I think we're going to have superwoman syndrome hitting women by the time they get to 30.
That women's studies has had on the media. It's been a negative effect, obviously.
And I think that a lot of people don't even understand what women's studies or feminism is, and the traditional idea of feminism just doesn't exist anymore.
One of the things that came out of what John Campbell was saying was that they all sat in a circle and talked about their experiences, and they got to him. One of the classic sort of arguments and criticisms of women's studies is that it ended up sort of imprinting that sort of social template that all women are victims and all men are victimisers, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that all women aren't victims, and women kind of manipulate that to a certain extent, that they play on that victimisation and that manipulation of their role. And I think that until we kind of discuss it in a gender forum and bring it into gender studies and kind of bring men into it as well, you're not going to lose that manipulation or that victimisation, and women will continue to play on that.
Well, see, that comes back to my point that I would never use women's studies, academia, whatever you like to call it, as a role model, if you like, as something to look to as a journalist. I mean, when I got my first job at the end of 1972 from Wellington Polytech at Eve magazine in Auckland, there was Eve and there were Thursday, 2 women's magazines, which were sort of precursors to Metro and North and South. They weren't like Women's Weekly, New Idea. They had feature stories and things. Rosemary McLeod was there, people like that. I was told, be very clear, you've got this job in spite of going to journalism school, not because of it. Publications were very anti-academia because just before that you came up through cadetships. And you were never influenced by academia. It was a no-no. And we were taught you didn't matter. What you thought meant nothing. You never brought yourself into the story. You were not allowed to be influenced by what you read or by whether you were a feminist, left-wing, right-wing, whatever you were.
But part of studying women's studies is that you're studying the language of power, essentially. Isn't that a really good starting point for a journalist? I mean, isn't that what a journalist does?
Only if it makes you strong and tough and not scared of anyone and go out there and come back with your story and write it without fear or favour, but not in terms of your politics or your personal opinions.
Yeah, I mean, if I didn't have a great deal of sympathy for women's studies before I came, I certainly do now. It's extraordinary to hear this. I mean, for a start, Deborah, everybody brings politics to the task of journalism. The only real distinguishing factor, I think, is whether you acknowledge it or not. And every story is a political story. I think it's a myth that is sadly, sadly, I think it's a myth that has a real grip on the teaching of journalism in New Zealand, that somehow the journalist can be objective, that somehow the journalist can take themselves out of the story. But I mean, I want to get back.
You compared yourself of any sexist language. I mean, I was thinking of a story in the New Zealand Herald actually.
The period of New Zealand history that Deborah is describing. Those 2 magazines would have been islands of relative sanity in a sea of sexism. New Zealand journalism in those days was a bloke's affair. Editors saw women as either page 3 girls or the ones who looked after the cooking section.
Yeah, Judy McGregor was one of those editors.
And for God's sake, I mean, if women's studies and feminism did nothing else, it was challenged that sort of nonsense. And, for the best part of 20 years, political discourse in New Zealand was actually strongly influenced by feminist ideology and by the sort of graduates that women's studies departments produced. And, I think we're in real danger at the moment of sliding back into that. I am sure that the women who marched in the 70s for emancipation and equality did not expect their daughters 20 years later to be wearing T-shirts saying porn star. I really don't think that was what was in their mind.
I think we're going to have to end on that. That's the show, everybody. Thanks to Deborah Coddington, Hannah Lynch and Chris Trotter. Next week, Russell will be back with an hour-long special from the annual Webstock Conference in Wellington. We'll see you then. Goodbye.